and Darcy dedicated to smoking. Smoke paves and commemorates an ominous memory. Darcy hides, hiding that fantasy of his. The smoke expands, hiding her. Poor Darcy, the smoke is consuming her. Despite hiding, the smoke does not completely hide her. The gray is not prominent. It denotes a faint transparency, which at a certain distance reveals Darcy's silhouette. From a distance, she looks happy. The smile of a soul that has found its way warms. I move away from her every time and I can't see her anymore. She disappears completely. I don't appreciate her smile, nor the path that soul will follow. Darcy, without fear of making a mistake, answers just to show off her voice, a cry that breaks as she babbles. Perhaps the smoke is not letting her breathe. Get out of the smoke, Darcy, some told him. I wasn't one of those. He was just a distant observer and worried to hear his voice. I just watched her say that one of her dreams would be like walking away from her heart to find a new one. He seemed to be uttering someone else's words, but he was sure that it was not a delusion of his, nor a pretentious act. His face confessed the truth. Darcy didn't understand what the point was in staying hidden behind something that wasn't even solid. It was only intended to be a diffuse, temporary clouding. It was a matter of time for that smoke to dissipate. Impossible for it to be permanent. One would have to wait by her side to realize that she was more alive than all of us. And if you realized that it was unnecessary for you to make her laugh, each puff was a gesture that enlivened that joy by being accompanied by that smoke, which could well disappear, but not cease to exist. That smoke always manifested itself when Darcy clamored for his company, becoming his confidant. He used it when he needed to express something. A smile, a cry, a concern, a delirium, a conjecture, a need, an ailment. It became present more and more in his life. Suddenly, the smoke disappeared again and, in Darcy's eyes, signs of confusion appeared. His face cried out for attention, attention from the most trivial and impertinent subject who would become memorable at his side. The smoke, that sullen, unpleasant, and flattering vapor, belittles no one, not even Darcy's idyllic intentions. She seemed to follow in the footsteps of an ethereal dream that approached the warmest of horizons in search of the sun. A sun that would disperse the most effusive and resplendent ray. One that, no matter how overwhelming it was, could not wake Darcy from that hidden dream. Now I look at Darcy again, and she no longer recognizes anyone. I barely recognize that look, that despite the resentment he murmurs, he came to appreciate that fantasy of his. His gaze wants to follow his steps, but that is impossible because she no longer walks now. His attempts to walk again have caused him to stumble again and again, hurting himself and generating that irremediable resentment towards his fragility and uselessness. Angry at her body, at her nature, for making her so weak, he looks for some excuse with which he can remedy his insolvent condition. He increasingly seeks to expand that hiding place of his, that place that becomes increasingly darker because the smoke with which he has made it has become more sullen, turning into a completely arrogant color in a highly suffocating environment. But she doesn't seem to judge by scent or color. Just let the fragility of your feet find the inopportune slip that leads it to slip freely until you find some colorful place within all that bitterness that appears to be the smoke with its prominent, reprehensible appearance. Although Darcy learned to love something outside of his appearance, he made the mistake of practicing it prematurely. Love without regrets. He wants without any interest. He dedicates as much time to it as those he lost, finding that reason to love. He didn't judge her because that's where that feeling of inappropriate love was born. That indecisive freedom to love out of softness, that docility exposed to the perversion of a uniform smoke that becomes narrow when it reaches one's heart, consuming everything inadvertently. And then, Darcy. He got that long-awaited whim of finding a new heart. But he chose to observe only his dreams without being able to wake up from them, losing himself in that horizon that revealed a completely worn-out sun, one that was about to make a big bang. She would only be there to witness the imminent explosion, which in the form of a furious breeze, would drag her with such brutality, returning her, without a whimper, towards her reality, towards her new heart, towards her monotonous stay of her unseemly life. Darcy managed to wake up, but with a moaning pain in his head, a pain that forced her to compress her eyes again and again, causing her eyelashes to fall, one by one, due to the force with which she exerted each eye pressure. His eyes, his gaze, the only support to his sanity, he was losing. I didn't want to witness that. I abandoned her without looking back. In one way or another, her cries were the only ones that accompanied me until I lost that only hook that attracted me to her gloomy wanderings full of innocent effervescence, which induced her to hide in other people's nightmares. As if walking away from her was like wandering through the desert carrying with me only a canteen full of pleasant memories of her voice, being my only relief to quench that thirst in the midst of this inhospitality outside of her presence. I decided to find myself in an extremely comfortable place, one in which I can talk about this with raw solvency, without being affected by my contemptuous attitude of leaving her stranded in her isolated nightmare. There was no one at his side, not even a friend, but I knew how to understand his unbalanced condition due to the way he walked, observed, spoke, smiled, and cried. I always felt at her side until I let my guard down and didn't want to know more about her. I have not seen her for a long time. I guess if I see her again, it would be impossible to recognize her. Now, I don't even remember his voice anymore. I am only accompanied by that ominous memory of the last thing she did before abandoning her. She, from her pocket, took out a cigarette that seemed to be worn out due to its irreparably deformed state. It seemed to have been forgotten in her pocket for a long time, or perhaps she kept it, placing in it a high sentimental value that only she could reveal. He had conceived it as a last resort, a palliative without prejudice. It was difficult for him to turn it on, but in the end he managed it. He spent hours with that cigarette, which seemed to never end. He seemed to smoke as if it were the last time he would do it, or the last thing he would do. The hours continued to pass and I realized that she would be like this all day. An endless day in which Darcy dedicated himself to smoking to disappear completely.